Another elevator that we'd like to look at is the Botsford elevator. That was located just north of Pine Grove Park at the foot of Sedgwick Street. In the satellite view, you can see Sedgwick Street going straight up. That's that light road. It dead ends before it gets to the Edison Parkway. And the elevator was located right about where the red rectangle is. The elevator at the top is the Botsford elevator. Here's a view from Pine Grove Park looking at the elevator. You can see a ship. I'm not sure if that ship is going to dock at the elevator or not, but ships did dock there. I found this great photograph when I was going through the Detroit archives, and it's a picture of a ship that's docked at the Botsford elevator. That's the Botsford elevator you see in the background. We'll zoom in here and get a little closer look at it. And that was the scene on November 5th, 1901. The ship that was docked there at the time was called the Spokane, and that's what you see in this photograph here. And this was the front page of the Daily Herald on that date. Great fire loss. Botsford elevators were totally destroyed by fire last night. Loss is over $300,000. Fire casts its reflection over the whole city. A charred and twisted pile of smoking, steaming debris marks the spot today on the bank of the St. Clair River, where yesterday $250,000 of property and buildings and grain were represented. This blackened mass of ruins is a result of a fire which raged in the buildings of the Botsford Elevator Company last night. It was about 8 o'clock when the blaze was first discovered in the marine lake with which the steamer Spokane was being loaded. The friction produced by the passage of the grain through the lake is thought to have set fire to the easily combustible dust, and in almost a fraction of a minute it seemed the flame shot forth in uncontrollable fury. I think the lake they're referring to is like a chute that went from the ship to the grain elevator. The paper said it was loading the ship, it actually was unloading the ship. And the chute was made of wood, and they actually ended up chopping it with axes to separate it from the rest of the chute that was aflame. So they cast off the lines and went out into St. Clair River. And so the Spokane was saved and unloaded the rest of the grain at the Grand Trunk grain elevator. The next fire we want to look at occurred 14 years after the fire at the Botsford elevators, 1915. It was only a stone's throw away from the elevators. It was the Grand Trunk freight sheds. On this illustrated map, you can see Pine Grove Park when it used to have that oval racetrack, and you can also see the Botsford elevators. But just to the right of that, there was a long line of Grand Trunk freight sheds. Very long. It was very long and narrow. It was over 700 feet, almost 800 feet long. The freight sheds were owned by Grand Trunk, but they were used by the steamers of the Port Huron and Duluth Steamship Company, which carried freight between Port Huron and Duluth. The westbound freight is brought to Port Huron on Grand Trunk cars and reshipped by the boats of the steamship concern to Duluth in the Canadian Northwest. Eastbound freight is brought in by the boats of the concern and loaded onto freight cars for shipment to eastern points. The photograph that was in this ad was one of the Port Huron and Duluth Steamship Company ships, the Lakeland. Here's a little better picture of it. And as you can see from the ad I just showed you, freight wasn't the only thing they hauled, but also passengers. And the Lakeland was their finest passenger ship. It carried 215 passengers. The other two ships carried smaller amounts, like 25 on each ship. But this was the pride and joy of their fleet. The second ship in their line was the Lake Port, which you can see right here. There was also a third ship called the Lake Wood, which I don't have a photograph of. Looking down from this satellite view, the freight line today would have been right about where the red box that you can see here. It was at the foot of Thomas Street. Of course, at that time, Thomas Street went all the way to the freight sheds. In this photograph that was taken from the north end of the Pine Grove Park, you can see the ship, the Lakeport, docked at the shipping line there at the sheds. There was quite a large article written about the shipping line the same year as the fire. And you can see here it says Port Huron's excellent transportation facilities. And I told you I didn't have a picture of the Lake Wood, but I guess I do because this photograph here is captioned the Lakewood. The fire occurred on 4th of July weekend, the long weekend, actually on Monday. On that Saturday, the Lake Land was at the docks and it took off in the afternoon for Duluth. But had that ship been on the dock, or any of the ships for that matter, it would have been completely destroyed in the fire because you can see how close the ship is right to the sheds. And you can also see that loading that ship was all manual labor. The next day, on Tuesday, this was the front page of the Times-Herald. Grand Trunk Sheds burn. Former employee held as suspect. Alleged grudge against foreman leads to arrest. Port Huron and Duluth Steamship Company and Grand Trunk Railroad are hard hit by Monday's fire. The Grand Trunk freight sheds at the foot of Thomas Street and the office building of the Port Huron and Duluth Steamship Company are today a mass of ruins as a result of the disastrous fire which swept the dock property late Monday afternoon. It goes on to say the range light, which is of great value to the mariners in guiding their boats into the St. Clair River at night from Lake Huron, was destroyed by the fire which swept the sheds. The light was located just north of the building, and the intense heat caused the iron framework to twist, and finally the light toppled over. The supply of oil, which is stored in the tank attached to the light, added fuel to the flames. It is probable that a temporary light will be maintained at that point until a permanent range light is replaced in position. Well, if you're wondering what a range light is, this is what a range light looks like today. But the one they're talking about probably looked more like the one I grew up with, which is, this one right here you can see as we zoom in, except that back then you had an oil tank attached to it for fuel. After the fire destroyed the Botsford elevator in 1901, the property sat idle for a few years, but in 1906, a new business went in there. They built a factory that was called the Summers Fiber Company. It says new factory will soon be completed. Binding twine will be manufactured. But they made many things, including rugs, as you can see in this ad from Measle, Hogan, and Eichhorn. We have purchased from the Summer Fiber Company a limited quantity of mill remnants consisting of assorted colors in their new linen rug, and it goes on to say the sizes. In this early postcard, which showcases the riverfront of the Pine Grove Park, if we look all the way to the end of it, as we zoom in here, that large gray building, that was the Summers Fiber Company. And to give you an idea of the flavor of the era of that time, this postcard depicts it well. And if you look closely between the trees, you can see the Summers Fiber Company peeking in there. But it's really interesting to see the folks and how they're dressed back then. The last fire we want to look at is the Grand Trunk elevator. The newspaper said that the Grand Trunk elevator was at the foot of Minnie Street. Well, of course, Minnie Street actually ended at Military Street. And then you had homes there, of course, and behind that was the railroad yards, and then you had the elevator. But if Minnie Street did go all the way to the elevator, that's where it would be, at the foot of Minnie Street. You have to remember, behind Military Street and along the shoreline there at Vantage Point, this is what it used to look like. It was all railroad. The elevator would have been way down at the far end where that second loading platform is. So the next time you're taking a walk along the shoreline, just remember that one time there was a doozy of a fire here. On December 9th, 1924, it was the first time that the newspaper said there was $1 million fire loss. Thousands watched flames devouring great structure. 600,000 bushels of grain destroyed. $75,000 insurance on $250,000 damage to building. It goes on to say damage roughly estimated at $1 million resulted early today when the Grand Trunk elevator at the foot of Minnie Street, an old landmark and the last of the large elevators between this port and Detroit, was completely destroyed with its contents, 600,000 bushels of mixed grains. The blaze, one of the most spectacular in the city's recent history, was watched in its various stages by thousands of Port Huron residents, many of whom were awakened by the glare of the flames against the early morning sky. Cause of the fire is unknown. The steel barge Alex Maitland was berthed at the elevator dock, and before the tugs, Sarnia City and Peter Pan II, could tear its 3 cables loose, the barge and the elevator were roaring furnaces, with its port side red hot, its upper works ablaze, and the cargo on fire. The Maitland was towed downstream by the 2 tugs and came to anchor in St. Clair River. The ship was anchored opposite about where St. Joseph Mercy Hospital is today, and the fire then was extinguished by the Marysville Fire Department. The following day on the front page of the newspaper, it showed pictures of the Maitland and the damage she suffered with the fire. But when it was on dock, when the grain elevator was on fire, the barge Maitland was held fast to the dock by 3 steel cables within a few feet of the burning elevator. Flames licked its steel port side until it was red hot. People said they could see the ribs through the red-hot steel. The boat's upper works were ablaze, owing to the intense heat and the fact that the cables were held fast on drums aboard the ship, which could only be released by action of a compressor. Men were unable to cast off the cables and permit the boat to drift out to the danger zone. The 2 tugs with lines attached to the ship pulled and tugged, but it was not until the cables either melted or were burned loose from the piles that the Maitland could be moved. When the craft started downstream in tow of the tugs, it was a roaring furnace. The red-hot port side stood out in bold relief against the breaking dawn of day, and flaming upper works helped to illumine the sky. I'm glad that the paper furnished pictures, because when I think of a barge, I just think of a flat wooden skull that has nothing on the upper decks. But this one looked almost like a small freighter. It had a pilot house and a smokestack, but I assumed that the power generated was for heat and lights. The elevators in our city certainly had a sad ending. Almost all of them were destroyed by fire, at a great loss to the owners, but it's part of our history, so I thought I'd share it. Join me in my next video and we'll see what there is to see.